Welcome back. It is time now for Campaign Chronicles. With just 10 days to go before the French choose their president, Europe and the economy have been largely absent from the campaign so far. They made headlines yesterday as markets tumbled across the continent. And Nicolas Sarkozy told voters that if they didn't re-elect him, France would follow Greece and Spain into bankruptcy, no less. But how worried are French voters about the state of the economy? Our press reviewer, Elena Casas, takes a look.
In any election, domestic issues come top of voters' concerns, pushing Europe right down the list. France's relationship with Germany has got lots of media attention, but voters are more worried about the fate of the euro.
Cutting deficits is important to get us out of this crisis, but maybe not as harshly as we've seen in Greece.
I think maybe we should pick new entrants to the EU more carefully, but once they're in, we have to help them as much as possible. We need to be united for Europe.
I think it's important to support other countries, but only up to a point. They're responsible for their acts.
According to our expert, those reactions are pretty typical of the French.
Supporting other countries is important for the French. We saw they backed the original Greek bailout. That solidarity is part of France's political culture. I think it's interesting what the second person said about choosing new entrants to the EU carefully. So people are questioning its enlargement. But she immediately started talking about solidarity. She might just as well have said enlargement is a catastrophe. We should have stuck with 6 countries in the EU. You do hear that in France sometimes.
The economic crisis has seen Euroscepticism rise in France. Half of voters now think the single currency wasn't such a good idea and want to take back decision-making powers from Brussels.
Well, having polled opinion out and about, Elena now joins me here in the newsroom. It seems that people really don't think that single currency was such a good idea. Were they really as anti-European as that?
Well, the theme of trade protectionism has become a huge subject of this campaign, hasn't it? It started with François Bayrou and Nicolas Sarkozy saying he wants to impose protectionist tariffs unilaterally in France, even if Europe doesn't want to do it as a whole, in order to protect French jobs from being outsourced abroad. And polls have shown really what those voters I spoke to did then, that the French want that. They think globalisation has gone too far. It hasn't helped them in France. La Croix is in a poll today, which quite surprisingly says 77, I think, % of voters actually think Sarkozy's idea of imposing those trade tariffs unilaterally is a good idea. Only a third of people polled in that say that they think globalisation has done them any favours, despite the fact that, of course, it's made products cheaper in France if they're produced in China. But only 22% of people think globalisation has been a good thing for France. Most of them think that it's caused France to lose skills and savoir-faire that people working in this country had before, now that everything's being produced more cheaply, principally in China. So globalisation very unpopular in that poll, and Europe equally so. 2/3 of people polled said they wanted France to restore powers, especially on economic issues, from Brussels.
Now, the right are saying that Hollande's policies will plunge France into economic chaos. Surely that's scaremongering.
Well, Le Figaro, the right-wing paper, has certainly jumped on this idea of trade protectionism, and especially how left-wing candidates like Jean-Luc Mélenchon are really very keen on it indeed. Their front page today says that the extreme left has put Hollande under surveillance, saying effectively that he's going to be pushed far too far to the left on these kinds of economic issues by the influence of Mélenchon. But the Nouvel Observateur says that Sarko, or chaos, if you like, is a very last-ditch, desperate policy coming from the UMP there. They say Sarkozy himself has increased France's debt by 500 million euros, and in every election the right evokes the spectre of the extreme left to try and scare voters off. In 1981, before the election of François Mitterrand, they say to listen to the right talk, you would have thought they expected Soviet tanks to come marching up the Champs-Élysées. That didn't happen then, and it won't happen now. They're just scaremongering, they say. Over at Slate, though, they have a Spanish writer who says that, well, François Hollande's election might sow chaos in Europe, but in a positive sense. They're talking about the fact that he, of course, wants to renegotiate the European Budget Treaty, which forces all states at the moment into pretty tight budget limits. They say that could be great for all across Europe, especially countries like Spain and Greece that are really suffering under the current austerity measures.
Elena Casas with the very latest there from the French presidential campaign race. Thanks very much indeed. We're just coming up to 10 o'clock here in Paris. Our main headline this morning, the opposition in Syria has called for Syrians to go out onto the street and protest as the ceasefire agreed as part of Kofi Annan's peace plan seems to be holding. It's been in place for several hours now, and the guns seem to have been silenced despite earlier doubts this week about the regime's compliance with the peace plan. The opposition then in Syria calling on Syrians to head out into the street to test it. We'll be back in a couple of minutes with all the very latest international headlines. Thanks very much for watching. Do stay with us.
Despite an outstanding seafaring heritage and the second largest area of territorial waters in the world, France no longer rules the waves.
I hope that at least one boat will continue to fly the French flag.
In my opinion, the real problem today isn't foreign workers. The real problem is a lack of cargo. There isn't enough work. That's the real issue.
With fishing quotas, foreign competition and rising fuel costs, can the decline of the French maritime sector, providing 400,000 jobs, be halted? Reporters, today, 9:45 p.m. Paris time on France 24.